Professor Velthari's forearms shook slightly as she fiddled with her translation device for the third time in 2 minutes. The crystalline being had taught xenobiology for over 2 centuries, but she had never felt this nervous before a lecture. Standing beside her was Dr. Kim Minho, a creature that looked deceptively harmless with his soft skin and gentle smile. He was the first human ever hired by the Galactic University, and today he would explain to her students why his species was considered the most terrifying in the known galaxy. The lecture hall buzzed with excited chatter in dozens of languages. 23 different species had gathered for this special course on Deathworld survival mechanisms. Word had spread across the university about the human professor, and students had traveled from distant star systems just to attend. There were the floating Nethkim, who existed as clouds of sentient gas, the rock-like Granadians who communicated through vibrations in the floor, and the delicate whisper folk whose voices were so soft they needed amplifiers to be heard. Minho stepped forward, and the room fell silent. Even the usually chatty Bubbleians stopped their constant popping sounds. He looked out at the sea of alien faces, tentacles, eye stalks, and energy fields that served as his audience. Some students were taking notes on crystal tablets, others were recording with bioluminescent organs, and a few were simply staring in fascination at the legendary Deathworlder. The human cleared his throat and began to speak in a calm, friendly tone that made his words even more disturbing. He explained that every single day, humans woke up on a planet that was actively trying to end their existence. The students looked confused at first, thinking this was some kind of metaphor or philosophical statement. But Minho continued with scientific precision, describing how Earth's sun bombarded the planet with deadly radiation every moment of every day. A featherwing student raised one of her delicate appendages and asked in a musical voice how humans could possibly survive such an attack. Minho smiled and explained that humans had learned to coat their skin with chemical barriers every morning, and that without this protection, their cells would begin dying within minutes of sun exposure. The classroom erupted in worried chirps, clicks, and electronic beeps as the students processed this information. But then Minho dropped the real bombshell. He told them that this same deadly radiation was actually what powered almost all life on Earth. Plants absorbed this dangerous energy and converted it into food, which animals then ate to survive. The students sat in stunned silence, trying to understand how anything could live in such conditions. Several of the gentle ones began weeping their characteristic silver tears, overwhelmed by the tragedy of human existence. The human professor continued his lesson, describing Earth's atmosphere. With the same casual tone he might use to discuss the weather, he explained that the air pressure on his planet would literally crush most of the species in the room, squeezing their bodies until they collapsed. The puffballs, who lived in near vacuum conditions, began hyperventilating at the thought of such oppressive atmospheric weight pressing down on them constantly. Then Minho mentioned gravity, and half the class started taking emergency notes. Earth's gravitational pull was so strong that it would pin many species helplessly to the ground, unable to move or escape. The flying species in the room looked particularly horrified, imagining their wings being useless against such a powerful force. Some of the gas giants began to compress themselves unconsciously, afraid that even thinking about Earth's gravity might somehow affect them. But the worst revelation was yet to come. Minho began describing the oxygen content of Earth's atmosphere, and the mood in the room shifted from horror to absolute terror. He explained that humans breathed a gas that was so reactive and corrosive that it would be toxic to over half the species in the classroom. This oxygen was so dangerous that it caused metal to rust and organic materials to decay, yet humans not only breathed it constantly, but actually required it to survive. 3 students immediately excused themselves from the class. A Nervisian began having what appeared to be a panic attack, its color shifting rapidly through the spectrum of distress. 2 of the worrywarts started making urgent calls to their emergency psychological support networks, convinced they were suffering from some kind of mental breakdown that was making them imagine impossible things. The remaining students sat in shocked silence, staring at the human who had just casually described living conditions that sounded like a description of the worst torture chamber in the galaxy. And this was just his gentle introduction to the horrors of daily life on Earth. Dr. Kim Minho walked into the lecture hall the next day to find twice as many students as before. Word had spread across the university about his previous lesson, and now creatures from every corner of the galaxy had squeezed into the room. Some were hanging from the ceiling, others had phased partially through the walls, and a few energy beings were simply floating near the light fixtures. The excitement was electric, literally in some cases. Minho decided to ease into today's topic by discussing what he considered the most basic and harmless substance on Earth: water. He pulled up a holographic display showing Earth's blue oceans and explained how this simple molecule covered most of his planet's surface. The students seemed relaxed as he described water's properties as a universal solvent, something many of them were familiar with from their own worlds. The mood began to shift when Minho mentioned that water made up about 60% of the human body. Several students started taking notes, fascinated by the idea that humans were essentially walking bags of solvent. But then the human professor dropped his first bombshell of the day. He casually mentioned that humans regularly threw themselves completely into large bodies of this substance for something they called fun. A bubbly student popped loudly in confusion and asked for clarification. Minho smiled and explained that humans would often spend hours submerged in water, sometimes in vast oceans or lakes, purely for entertainment. The students looked puzzled until one of the smarter tentacoloids asked the obvious question, how did humans breathe underwater? The answer sent ripples of shock through the classroom. Humans couldn't breathe water at all. In fact, if water got into their breathing system, they would die within minutes. Yet they regularly put themselves in situations where they were completely surrounded by a substance that could kill them, and they did this for pleasure. The crystal line students began making sharp ringing sounds of distress, their way of expressing complete bewilderment at such seemingly suicidal behavior. Minho tried to calm them down by explaining that humans were careful and used safety measures. But this only made things worse when he mentioned that some humans deliberately dove as deep as possible into these deadly water environments, seeing how long they could hold their breath before their bodies started shutting down from oxygen deprivation. Before the students could fully process this information, Minho moved on to discuss human nutrition. He started with what he thought was another gentle topic: spices. The professor explained that humans had discovered certain plants produced chemicals to protect themselves from being eaten. These chemicals were essentially natural weapons designed to cause pain and deterrence to any creature that tried to consume them. The logical response, Minho continued, would be for humans to avoid these plants entirely. Instead, humans actively sought them out and deliberately added them to their food. The classroom fell silent as the implications sank in. A peacefully in student raised a trembling appendage and asked why humans would voluntarily cause themselves pain during the essential act of eating. Minho's answer horrified them even more. Humans didn't just tolerate the pain from these chemical weapons, they actually enjoyed it. They had developed a taste for the burning sensation that these plant toxins caused in their mouths and throats. Some humans even competed to see who could withstand the most powerful versions of these chemical weapons, treating it as a form of entertainment. The Zephyrian student, whose species communicated through color-changing skin patterns, began flashing rapid sequences of red and black, the universal distress signal among their kind. Other students started making worried noises in their various languages as Minho continued his explanation. He told them about something called hot sauce competitions, where humans would consume increasingly concentrated versions of capsaicin, the chemical weapon found in spicy plants, until their bodies couldn't handle anymore. But Minho wasn't finished with his revelations about human dietary habits. He moved on to discuss something that made the previous examples seem reasonable by comparison: alcohol. He explained that this was a substance that was literally poisonous to human physiology. It damaged their organs, impaired their brain function, and in sufficient quantities could kill them outright. The students waited for him to explain how humans avoided this dangerous substance. Instead, Minho told them that humans had independently invented ways to create alcohol on every continent of their planet. They consumed it regularly in social situations, often in quantities that would be fatal to smaller species. They even had special occasions dedicated entirely to consuming this poison in large amounts. The classroom erupted into chaos. Students began frantically scribbling notes, trying to understand how humans had developed such incredible resistance to toxins. Others were making emergency calls to their home planets, warning their governments about the poison-resistant species they had discovered. The worrywart delegation began having a collective nervous breakdown, convinced that humans were some kind of toxic immune superspecies that posed a threat to all other life. A brave rockoid student managed to ask how humans could possibly survive regular consumption of literal poison. Minho explained that human bodies had developed the ability to process small amounts of alcohol, though it still caused damage. He mentioned that some humans could consume amounts that would kill other species, and that human cultures had developed elaborate social rituals around the consumption of various types of poison. The lecture ended with students stumbling out of the classroom in various states of shock, many of them questioning everything they thought they knew about biology, chemistry, and the basic survival instincts that governed all intelligent life in the galaxy. By the third day, the lecture hall was packed beyond capacity. Students were sitting in the aisles, floating near the ceiling, and some had even set up viewing screens in adjacent rooms. News of Dr. Kim Minho's lectures had spread across multiple star systems, and beings were traveling enormous distances just to hear about the impossible biology of humans. The excitement in the room was palpable, as creatures from dozens of worlds waited to learn more about these legendary Deathworlders. Minho began his lecture by placing his hand over his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his ribs. He told the students that inside every human was a muscular pump that never stopped working from the moment they were born until the day they died. This wasn't unusual. Many species had similar organs. What made humans different was what this pump was actually doing every second of every day. He explained that human hearts were pushing corrosive, oxygen-rich blood through their bodies under pressure that would literally explode the circulatory systems of most other species. The students listened in growing amazement as Minho described a network of blood vessels so extensive that if laid end to end, they would stretch for thousands of miles. All of this delicate tubing was constantly under pressure from the powerful heart, carrying a fluid so chemically aggressive that it would burn through the biological systems of half the species in the room. A gentle stream student, whose species had a very delicate circulatory system that used low-pressure liquid flows, asked how humans could possibly survive such violent internal conditions. Minho's answer shocked them even more. He explained that humans could actually survive significant damage to this system and keep functioning. He told stories of humans who had continued to fight, run, or work, even after losing substantial amounts of blood or suffering heart damage that would instantly kill most other species. The Flutterwing delegation began making distressed chirping sounds as they tried to process this information. Their own circulatory systems were so fragile that even minor pressure changes could be fatal. The idea of living with such violent internal forces seemed impossible to them. But Minho wasn't finished describing human internal biology. He moved onto what he called the human immune system, and his description made it sound like each human was carrying around their own personal army. He explained that every human body contained trillions of microscopic organisms, bacteria, viruses, and other life forms that would be deadly to most species in the room. The students sat in stunned silence as Minho described how humans maintained what he called controlled biological warfare inside their bodies. These weren't parasites or infections, he explained, but beneficial organisms that humans needed to survive. The human digestive system, skin, and other organs were home to vast colonies of creatures that would kill other species on contact. Sterile being student, whose species lived in completely clean environments and would die from any bacterial contamination, began having what appeared to be a panic attack. The idea that humans were walking around with trillions of potentially lethal organisms living inside them was too much for their mind to process. Then Minho mentioned fever, and the classroom temperature seemed to drop several degrees as species throughout the room felt a chill of fear. He explained that when humans got sick, their bodies would deliberately raise their internal temperature to levels that would literally cook many of the species in the room alive. This wasn't an accident or a malfunction. It was a purposeful, biological response designed to kill harmful organisms through heat. The cryonauthy student, whose species lived in near-freezing conditions, immediately requested emergency medical attention. The idea of any creature deliberately raising their body temperature to potentially lethal levels was so alien to their biology that they couldn't comprehend it without professional help. As if the previous revelations weren't disturbing enough, Minho then began discussing human reproduction and child-rearing practices. He explained that human offspring were born in a state that most species would consider a biological failure. Human babies couldn't walk, couldn't feed themselves, couldn't communicate effectively, and were completely dependent on their parents for survival. This might have seemed like a weakness until Minho described what happened when human parents perceived any threat to their helpless young. He told the students that human parents would transform into terrifyingly aggressive creatures, capable of fighting with strength and determination that defied all logical behavior. Parent humans had been known to fight off predators many times. Their size, lift impossible weights, and ignore serious injuries when protecting their children. The final revelation of the lecture left the entire classroom in stunned silence. Minho began describing how human children spent their time, and what he said challenged everything the students thought they knew about nurturing young life. Human children, he explained, played games that simulated violence, death, and warfare. They pretended to fight each other, acted out scenarios involving danger and conflict, and engaged in competitive activities designed to determine winners and losers. This wasn't accidental or harmful behavior that parents tried to stop. Minho continued, human adults actively encourage these activities because they helped children develop the skills they would need to survive on their dangerous planet. Human parents deliberately taught their offspring to be competitive, aggressive, and capable of violence when necessary. The students sat in shocked silence, finally understanding a terrible truth about humanity. These creatures didn't just accidentally survive on their impossible planet. They were systematically training each new generation to be even better at surviving in conditions that would destroy any other known form of life. The humans weren't just Deathworlders. They were creating new generations of increasingly capable Deathworlders through what they casually called childhood. The fourth lecture drew the largest crowd yet. Students had started camping outside the lecture hall days in advance, and the university had to set up overflow rooms with live feeds to accommodate everyone. Creatures from across the galaxy had heard rumors about Dr. Kim Minho's previous sessions, and many had traveled specifically to witness what was being called the most terrifying educational experience in the known universe. Minho walked into the packed auditorium and immediately noticed the nervous energy in the room. Translators were working overtime as dozens of species whispered to each other in anticipation. He smiled warmly at his audience, a gesture that somehow made his upcoming revelations even more unsettling. Today's topic was human adaptability, and Minho began by showing a holographic map of Earth. The students watched as he highlighted different regions of the planet, explaining that humans had not just survived on their death world, they had spread to every single continent. This might have seemed normal until he started describing the conditions in these places. First, he showed them the polar regions where humans lived permanently. The temperatures in these areas, he explained casually, were so cold that most species would freeze solid within minutes of exposure. The heat-loving delegation immediately began shivering despite the comfortable temperature in the lecture hall, just thinking about such conditions. Minho described how humans in these regions had learned to survive in temperatures that would turn their own body fluids into ice. Yet they not only lived there but had built thriving communities in these frozen wastelands. Then he moved to the opposite extreme, showing footage of human settlements in desert regions. The heat-seekers in the audience perked up with interest until Minho described the actual conditions. These deserts reached temperatures that would dehydrate most species within hours, with some areas hot enough to cook food on the ground. The water-dependent species in the room began making distressed gurgling sounds as they imagined their body fluids boiling away in such heat. But the most shocking revelation was about high-altitude human settlements. Minho explained that humans lived permanently on mountains where the air was so thin that oxygen-dependent species would suffocate and die. These weren't temporary visits or research stations. Entire human communities existed in conditions that would be fatal to most of the galaxy's intelligent life forms. A breath-easy student, whose species required rich, dense atmosphere to survive, asked how this was possible. Minho's answer was typically disturbing. Humans had simply adapted. Their bodies changed to function with less oxygen, their hearts worked harder, and they accepted the constant challenge of living in an environment that was trying to kill them, every moment of every day. Then Minho introduced a concept that broke several students' understanding of rational behavior: human recreational activities. He explained that after conquering the most dangerous environments on their planet, humans had decided to invent new ways to risk their lives for entertainment. The holographic display showed footage of something called extreme sports, and the students watched in growing horror. First came skydiving, humans deliberately throwing themselves out of flying vehicles high above the ground, trusting thin fabric and metal contraptions to prevent them from hitting the earth at fatal speeds. The flying folk in the audience, who had natural wings and perfect aerial control, watched in amazement as humans willingly gave up the safety of their aircraft to fall through the sky at terminal velocity. The mountaineering footage was even worse. Humans were shown climbing vertical rock faces and ice walls, deliberately putting themselves in situations where a single mistake would result in death. They did this not for survival or necessity, but purely for the challenge and enjoyment. Several species who lived in perfectly safe, flat environments began making sounds of distress as they watched humans hanging by their fingertips hundreds of feet above certain death. Deep-sea diving footage caused the aquatic species to have collective nervous breakdowns. They watched humans encasing themselves in artificial breathing systems and diving to crushing depths that would implode most life forms. The humans seemed to enjoy exploring environments that were hostile to their biology, seeking out the most dangerous underwater locations they could find. Motor racing was perhaps the most incomprehensible activity to the peaceful species in the audience. Humans had built machines that could move at speeds that would tear apart most biological forms, then deliberately raced these machines as close together as possible, often resulting in spectacular crashes that should have been fatal. The students watched footage of humans walking away from accidents that destroyed their vehicles completely, then getting into new machines to do it again. The harmony-seeking Silthek, who valued peace and safety above all else, began singing what sounded like funeral songs. They had misunderstood the footage, assuming they were watching human death rituals rather than entertainment. When Minho corrected them, explaining that these were recreational activities that humans did for fun, several of the Silthek fainted from shock. But the ultimate revelation came when Minho discussed human space exploration. He explained that humans had looked at the vacuum of space, an environment completely hostile to all known life, and decided to go there anyway. They had built thin metal containers, filled them with artificial atmosphere, and launched themselves into the void between worlds. The students sat in stunned silence as Minho described how humans had walked on their airless moon, sent probes to explore radiation-soaked planets, and were planning permanent colonies on worlds that lacked breathable atmospheres. The space-dwelling species in the audience, who had evolved in zero-gravity environments, watched in amazement as Minho showed footage of humans awkwardly moving in spacesuits, completely dependent on technology to survive in conditions that would kill them instantly. The lecture ended with a realization that sent shockwaves through the galactic academic community. Humans didn't just survive on their impossible death world. They had become so bored with merely surviving that they actively sought out new and more dangerous environments to conquer. They had turned survival into entertainment, and entertainment into a form of training for even more dangerous challenges. The students filed out of the lecture hall in various states of shock, finally understanding that humans weren't just adapted to danger, they were addicted to it. The final lecture had become the most anticipated educational event in galactic history. Students from across the universe had gathered, some traveling for months just to attend. The lecture hall couldn't contain the crowd, so the university had set up viewing stations on dozens of nearby planets. Media crews from every major civilization were broadcasting live, and several governments had sent official observers to document what they were calling the human revelation. Dr. Kim Minho walked into the packed auditorium to find representatives from over 100 different species waiting in complete silence. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and fear. After 4 sessions of learning about human biology and behavior, everyone knew this final lecture would either explain how humans had become such impossible creatures or reveal something even more disturbing about their nature. Minho began by addressing something that had puzzled the students throughout the course. They had been wondering how humans could possibly function psychologically while living in such constant danger. The answer, he explained, lay in understanding how human minds had adapted to their environment. What other species saw as extraordinary, bravery, or impossible courage, humans simply considered normal behavior. He described concepts that were fundamental to human psychology but completely alien to most other species. Courage wasn't something humans had to work up to or find within themselves. It was simply the default response to danger. When faced with a threat, humans didn't spend time calculating odds or seeking safety. They automatically moved toward the danger to confront it. This wasn't a conscious choice for most humans. It was as natural as breathing. The cautious ones in the audience began making worried clicking sounds as they tried to process this information. Their species spent considerable time and energy avoiding any potential threats, carefully calculating risks before taking any action. The idea that humans automatically moved toward danger was completely contrary to every survival instinct they understood. Minho continued by explaining human determination, the ability to continue working toward a goal despite obstacles, pain, or seemingly impossible odds. He told stories of humans who had survived in conditions that should have killed them simply because they refused to give up. Other species had survival mechanisms that helped them recognize when a situation was hopeless, so they could conserve energy for better opportunities. Humans seemed to lack this ability entirely, continuing to fight even when logic said they should surrender. But the most disturbing revelation was about human pack-bonding behavior. Minho explained that humans had evolved to form emotional connections not just with their own species, but with almost anything they encountered regularly. This included other species, inanimate objects, abstract concepts, and even creatures that were actively trying to kill them. The students listened in amazement as Minho told stories of humans who had sacrificed their lives to save complete strangers from other species. He described humans who had adopted and raised the offspring of creatures that most species would consider dangerous predators. The logical beings in the audience struggled to understand how humans could risk their most precious resource, their own lives, for beings who provided no genetic or survival advantage. Even more incomprehensible was the human tendency to form emotional bonds with their tools, vehicles, and living spaces. Minho showed footage of humans who had risked their lives to save objects that had no intrinsic value beyond their emotional attachment to them. He described humans who mourned the loss of machines, celebrated the birthdays of artificial intelligences, and formed lasting friendships with beings whose biology was completely incompatible with human life. The most shocking examples involved human relationships with Earth's apex predators. Minho showed footage of humans who had formed bonds with creatures that could easily kill them, large carnivorous animals that other species would flee from on sight. These humans didn't just coexist with these predators. They actively sought them out, played with them, and in some cases had died protecting them from other threats. A sensible folk student asked the obvious question, how did humans survive as a species if they were constantly forming suicidal emotional attachments to dangerous creatures and situations? Minho's answer revealed the final piece of the human puzzle. He explained that humans didn't consider any of this behavior unusual or exceptional. To them, their daily survival on Earth was routine and boring. The environmental challenges that other species found impossible were just normal weather conditions to humans. Their capacity for violence and destruction wasn't something they were proud of. Most humans considered it an unfortunate necessity that they wished they could avoid. The students sat in stunned silence as they realized the ultimate truth about humanity. These creatures had become so perfectly adapted to living with constant mortal danger that they had forgotten how extraordinary their existence was. They complained about minor inconveniences while casually surviving conditions that would wipe out entire civilizations. They worried about trivial social problems while their bodies automatically fought off diseases that would kill most other species. Minho concluded his lecture series with a simple statement that sent shockwaves through every species represented in the audience. He explained that humans generally considered themselves to be weak, fragile creatures who had to rely on technology and cooperation to survive in what they saw as a hostile universe. Most humans believed they were poorly adapted for survival, compared to other animals on their own planet. The lecture hall erupted into chaos as species throughout the galaxy tried to process this final revelation. The creatures they had spent weeks learning to fear, beings who seemed to possess impossible biological capabilities and terrifying psychological traits, didn't even realize they were unusual. Humans had become so adapted to their death world that they had lost all perspective on how extraordinary their existence truly was. As the students filed out of the final lecture, many of them realized they had learned something far more disturbing than just the biological details of human existence. They had discovered that somewhere in the galaxy was an entire species of creatures so perfectly adapted to impossible conditions that they had forgotten they were living a miracle every single day of their lives. The course ended with enrollment, requests for advanced human studies programs flooding in from every corner of the galaxy, as species everywhere tried to understand how they might survive in a universe that apparently contained creatures as impossible as humans.